And it's BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. I am very excited to have Miriam C. Davis on the program today. This is an interview that I've been looking forward to because Miriam C. Davis is the author of The Axeman of New Orleans, and that is really the only true book that is dedicated to this serial killer mystery. And I've had the opportunity to read her book as well as listen to her on some different programs, but this is the first time that we've had the opportunity to talk. And Miriam, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Ned. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. Thank you for joining us on Black Box Online Radio today. And just in case someone is not familiar with the Axeman story, would you like to provide a small introduction?
Well, the Axeman, it's the story of a serial killer around the time of the First World War in New Orleans who targeted, of all people, Italian grocers. That's kind of the elevator description of it.
Yes, and what first made you curious about this Axeman story?
Well, in the early 2000s, my brother was visiting, and he was reading one of John Douglas's, the guy who established the FBI Profiler program. He was reading one of his books, and we were just sitting around discussing serial killers, and he told me, I guess it was a crime anthology that he had read when he was young that mentioned a serial killer in New Orleans. And at that time, my husband and I went to New Orleans once or twice a year. And you know how you should be working on one project, but you procrastinate by Googling something else?
Yes.
So I just started Googling about the serial killer in New Orleans, and I discovered Robert Tallant's book, and I got a copy of it. And I got some other crime anthologies, and I realized that much of what was published was simply a rehash of what Tallant had written in the 1950s. But there was some disagreement about whether there had been any sort of related attack. The Axeman attacks that Tallant described began in 1918 with the Maggio attacks. But there, he raised the possibility there had been earlier attacks. And different crime writers disagreed about whether there had been any attacks in 1911. And on one of our trips to New Orleans, the library with the city records on the third floor is in the business district right across Canal Street from the French Quarter. So I went over there one Saturday afternoon, and I went through the homicide records. And I found a case of what was clearly related. It was an Italian grocer whose skull had been bashed in with a sharp implement in the middle of the night, named Joseph Davy. And, you know, and I discovered this within 2 hours. And so it made me think that since there was an answer to this question and had been relatively easy for me to find, that I thought maybe nobody had just really properly gone through the records and researched this case. And that's what made me decide that perhaps I should do it.
Okay, and for the audience, the book that she's been talking about is Ready to Hang by Robert Tallant, and it's a collection of different stories, and only one chapter in that book is dedicated to the Axeman, right? It actually gets the name Ready to Hang because of the second story in the book, which is about the case of Etienne Deschamps, and his chapter is called The Axeman Wore Wings, right?
Yeah.
Okay, though, so you found a story that you thought could be connected to the Axeman case, and you found that a lot of the narrative is just recycled from Robert Tallant's case, which I think I remember from your book. You said he's even gathering some of this information by just talking to people and having conversations. Maybe not like he's not like purely fraudulent, it's just a little bit inaccurate. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's trying to make a living as a writer, which means he has to, like writers today, you have to churn out books at a fairly regular pace. He was 10 years old about the time of the Axeman attacks. at the height of the hysteria of the Axeman attack. So he may have remembered them. He would have known, being a journalist, he would have known a lot of police officers who probably were around then and a lot of other journalists. And he probably just heard a lot of stories that had become part of the oral tradition that turned out not to be entirely accurate. So I don't think he was misrepresenting anything. I just think he was not in the position that we are now to do the kind of thorough research we can now, because obviously he wouldn't have had access to the homicide records because these were still open cases at the time.
Okay, though, so you were researching this and you said you found the story of Davy, and what exactly was something else what was the next step in your research process?
Well, I spent a summer of 2008, a month in New Orleans, going through all of the newspaper accounts. And there were 3 or 4 different newspapers in New Orleans at that time. Going through the different newspaper stories around all the dates that Talent had given, looking for stories that might be related to the Axeman case, and going through the homicide records, going through the coroner's reports, following up any lead I could find. And I found that there was an attack that I think is the first Axeman attack, although he was called the Cleaver at the time, in August of 1910, that a grocer, an Italian grocer named August Crudi, was attacked with basically what's a butcher's cleaver. And his wife was robbed. About a month later, another grocer, and this time his wife, were brutally attacked. Crudi wasn't badly hurt, it turned out, when she wiped all the blood off. He wasn't that badly hurt. But Joseph Rossetti and his wife, Concetta Rossetti, were very, very badly hurt, and they were attacked with a similar instrument, a meat cleaver, which was actually left on the scene. And these were being stolen from butcher shops. This was in the fall of 1910, and it's in the early summer of 1911 that Joseph Davy and his wife are attacked. And Joseph Davy his wife is hit, but not badly injured. But he is brutally attacked, and he does die. And this attacker is referred to as the Cleaver. And he disappears at this point. And I have, various guesses as to what might have happened to him. But then he reappears earlier than Talent thinks, because there's an attack that's not fatal on an Italian couple, again, grocers, called the Andolinas, in December of 1917 with a hatchet. But it's not until the attack on the Maggios in May of 1918 that you get, at that point on, there's always a fatality. At that point on, the Axeman always manages a death. And I think he's gotten more and more confident over time. And I asked a Georgia Bureau of Investigation profiler and a retired Atlanta homicide investigator. I described the Cleaver attacks and I described the Axeman attacks. And I said, is it possible that these were 2 different killers? And they said it was very unlikely, that the method of attack was so similar. And I think what's going on is that the attacker, when he steals a butcher's cleaver and leaves it at the scene, he's running a risk of being caught. And you don't want to be carrying a bloody cleaver through the streets of New Orleans at 3 a.m, because even in New Orleans, that's going to attract attention. But at that time, everybody owns an axe. because everybody has a wood-burning stove. So he solves his problem by using the axe that he finds on the scene. And so that's how I think he becomes the Axeman.
Okay, yes, and thank you. And once again, I am talking to Miriam C. Davis, author of The Axeman of New Orleans. And if there's anybody that you would like to request to have on the program, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. And you can also make recommendations for future topics. Every Thursday, I do a live stream where I can cover any subject under the sun or in the darkness. And you can always hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And feel free to go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. But Miriam, I'm going to be very honest with you. I first heard you on the Most Notorious podcast. Even before I read your book, I heard you do that interview. And I have some previous episodes about the Axeman of New Orleans here on Black Box Online Radio. And I did a response to that interview, amongst other sources. And what I said was in regards to that about contacting a behavioral profiler, that you have Cleaver attacks in the early 1900s, and then you have the Axeman attacks in 1918, 1919, that this has to be the same person. I said, that psychological profiler needs to go back to Psych 101. Of course, they can have different people. There could be different person committing these attacks and those attacks with that type of time frame. One's with a cleaver and one's with an axe. But then I read your book, and I was like, oh, I get it now. What meaning that attacking Italian grocers in the house, like home invasions, and it's not even like blunt force trauma, because the similarity between the cleaver and the axis is meant to more or less cut the person open as well as fracture their body, as horrible as that sounds. But once I actually heard your whole statement and process, I had a big reversal on that. And I was like, wow, now I get it. And I ultimately ended up agreeing with you and the psychological profiler whom I unfairly called out.
Well, I mean, I had that question, because, I mean, profiling is an art. It's not exactly a science. But I did think that when I looked at each individual case, that there seemed to be a real pattern. The attacker would attack from 1 to 3 in the morning, usually not every single time, but usually it was on a moonless night. He was going clearly, the woman and sometimes a child would be injured or killed, but he was clearly targeting the man. And so I just felt I could establish this pattern that there, because one of my original questions was there simply one attacker? Because Talent was not sure of that. And he says in his book that the people of New Orleans thought that, in fact, there were a series of different attackers, that many people did not, in fact, think that there was simply one killer.
Okay, though, but what is one aspect of the Axeman story that you find particularly shocking?
I found the murders of the Maggios particularly gruesome, particularly Catherine Maggio, because it looked like that what happened to her, she was not in fact hit with an axe at all. It looked like what happened to her is that her husband was attacked with an axe, that she got out of bed and went around to try to protect her husband, and the attacker turned around and slashed her with a razor, and her throat was cut so deeply. It cut her carotid artery and it cut her airway. And she basically choked to death on her own blood. And I just found that really, I mean, it was so sad, because so many of the women, the wives, survived. And if she had not tried to protect her husband like she did, she might well have survived. And I just found that really gruesome and sad at the same time.
But that is something that is different, though, because as you said, the
Mm-hmm.
women are not experiencing the brunt or like the full force of the
Mm-hmm.
brutality in the other crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And one reason why I did my first Axeman episodes in 2021 was it was requested by the listeners, but also I had noticed there were several comments coming in on my episodes about the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper, and they're saying, the Axeman of New Orleans is nothing more than yellow journalism. These are all unconnected attacks, and the newspapers just thought that it was the same person, or maybe they even made up fictitious connections. What evidence is there that there was a real serial killer? And I mean, like, there's at least one serial killer who's responsible for a large portion of these crimes.
Well, I do think that the press played a role in creating a legend of the Axeman, which wasn't quite accurate. I do think that's true. However, when you actually look, a lot of times you find the headline and the actual story doesn't match. The headline might say Axeman, but when you read the story, it's pretty clear that the details just don't match. When you read what's available in terms of coroner's reports and homicide records and the detailed, and the newspapers at that time published a level of detail that would never be published today. There did seem to me to be this pattern that fit a large number of the cases. Now, some of them didn't. Some of them, like Mike Pepitone, at first glance, it's not surprising that he gets lumped in with the Axeman killings. He's an Italian grocer. He's beaten to death in the middle of the night around the time that the Axeman is killing. But his wife saw two men. We have other witnesses who saw the Axeman, none of whom saw two men. He is beaten to death not with an axe, but with a pipe. And as you said, it was the Axeman wasn't just beating people to death, using the axe as blunt force trauma. He was using the sharp end of it to cut into their skulls, and often cutting into the brain. And he did have ties with what you might call the local Italian mafia. That is, he did have ties with sort of the Italian vendetta. So it's very likely that that's why he was killed.
And Mike Pepitone was the final victim, correct?
He was the final victim that is associated with this set of killings, yes. But as I argue, I don't think he's an Axeman killing at all. Now, in New Orleans, this brings the Axeman killings to a close, even though I argue he's not actually an Axeman killing. But I have found other killings in Louisiana, moving kind of westward, that looked to me to be the Axeman actually moving west, in Alexandria, Louisiana, in DeRidder, Louisiana, and what's the other one? I can't remember, but I've got it written down. But I think it's the same hours, 1 to 3, Italian grocer, axe. Even though sometimes in one case a child is killed, it's the man who is always killed. So I think, I speculate that it is the Axeman who seems to be moving out of New Orleans and moving westward through Louisiana.
Okay, though, but you have had an opportunity to evaluate this information at perhaps a higher level than anybody else in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about how we have the Cleaver attacks in the early part of the 1910s. Then we have the Axeman attacks in 1918, 1919, then possibly moving outside of New Orleans into other areas. But the Axeman and the Cleaver are attacking Italian grocers. More brutality is showed toward the man, but they don't seem to mind harming women or children, as we saw from the Court of Miglias as well.
Mhm.
You must have had a chance to think about why? Why is this person doing this? Like, what psychological factors are driving this person to kill? And you can speculate and theorize all you want. I mean, even if it's just
Mhm.
something that you've been curious about or thought about in the past, because this is not very typical of serial killers from the other cases I talk about on Black
Mhm.
Box Online Radio, breaking into people's homes at relatively the same time,
Mhm.
targeting grocers of Italian descent.
Mhm.
That's something that's almost majorly unique to this case. What do you think? Why is this person doing this?
Well, I think you have to understand that at this time, Italians, and they're mostly Sicilians, are taking over the corner grocery business in New Orleans. Now, remember, at this time, people don't have refrigerators, they have ice boxes. Women often go shopping twice a day for the noon meal and then again for the evening meal. And so there are small grocery stores on just about every corner. And I think at the beginning of the 20th century, Sicilian grocers have maybe 7% of them, and by the time we're talking about 1920, maybe something like 50% of them. I have the statistics in the book, but I'm not sure what I remember is accurate offhand. But they are in the process of taking over, and they're a rising class. They had been brought in to work in the sugarcane fields to pick cotton. When they came in, they were mostly illiterate. They were, in the racist South, considered in many cases little better than blacks. They were happy to work in the fields alongside blacks, which, white people weren't, um, this wasn't considered a proper thing to do for white people. So they were kind of liminal. They weren't quite white and they weren't quite black. But a lot of them were establishing small businesses. They were rising not really through education so much as through businesses, and some of them got quite wealthy. And as I said, they are taking over this kind of niche. So they're moving solidly into at least the lower middle class, the lower bourgeoisie. And the person who is described as the attacker is white but not Italian, and he is dressed as a working man. So I speculate, and it's only speculation, I can't prove it, is that somehow, oh, and this person is also probably a burglar, because he clearly he uses typical burglar's tools of the time, and he clearly has experience in breaking into places. And that's one of the first things that the police say about the Cleaver, as well as the Axeman, is that he's an experienced burglar. So he's a white working man, probably a burglar. He's got some grudge against Italians. Maybe he was sent to prison for burglary through the testimony of an Italian grocer. Maybe he came from a family that, lost out their business to the competition of Italian grocers. Maybe he's white and he resents this group of people who he thinks is lower than he is, doing so well. There's clearly some sort of resentment of this particular class of people, and it's, while it's not unknown for serial killers to want to wipe out certain classes of people. The ones that we tend to remember are the ones that involve some element of, say, sexual sadism, like Jack the Ripper, like Ted Bundy. Because if there's one thing that people are more interested in than death and murder, it's sex. And I think that's one of the reasons that the whole story of the Axeman would probably have died out if not for Robert Talent. But but I still found it interesting that.
Yes. Oh, please
No,
continue.
no, no. I mean, just that somebody had such a grudge against Italian grocers, um, that maybe just sprang from economic and social reasons. Yeah.
Yes, and the things that I had thought about in the past, I thought about that one over and over again, and I was like, well, maybe he was the son of an Italian, and maybe he just didn't have the conventional Italian appearance, and he hated his father. Maybe he got put out of business by a rival Italian grocer on a different
Mhm.
corner, and
Mhm.
just trying to think of it some way somehow, because it really is something that is rather bizarre. But there
Mhm.
is a theory that involves the mafia, right? That some people, like the mafia, has a reason for targeting these people. And would you like to talk about that one?
Well, at the time, you have the beginnings of what gets called the mafia. People at the time are more afraid of of what they call the mafia than they ought to be. The real mafia doesn't develop until Prohibition in the 1920s. But there are there's who wrote the book about the beginnings of the mafia in New York, and he also ties it to. There are some people who make the argument that there are the beginnings of the mafia. What I found was a kind of crime, not so much an organization, but a kind of crime called Black Hand crime, in which an Italian would be threatened. If you don't pay us off, we're going to do something bad. And often people's businesses would be burned down if they didn't pay. So my own view from what I found is not so much that there was an organization called the mafia there at the time, but there was a kind of crime um, called Black Hand crime. But usually they didn't kill people in this manner that we can tell. Usually it involved a bomb being thrown through the window, or it involved, burning the grocery to the ground. And, you know, a mafia assassin would be, I think, with the cleaver, you can see him getting more and more confident. And I think a mafia assassin would have been pretty efficient right from the beginning. So I was not persuaded by that.
Okay, those, and these are all different hypotheses that people have
Mm-hmm.
as to why the Axeman, and as well as the Cleaver,
Yeah.
being called the same person. The
Yeah.
Axeman is targeting
Mm-hmm.
grocers of Italian descent. But we still have a question to explore, and that is which crimes were committed by the Axeman? And you talked about the Crudy attack, with the first
Mm-hmm.
Cleaver attack, and the Davy attack. But there is the attack on the Skiambras that happened in the early part of that decade, right? And that becomes very important because that will tie into something that happens with the Axeman times. And would you like to talk about that one?
The Sciambra murder occurs in 1912. It's a young couple. I think they just had their first baby. They are grocers. But the husband, what is his name?
Tony.
He's killed in the middle of the night, but he's shot, and his wife is shot accidentally, and she dies as a result of infection. But it seems to me that that is a very different kind of murder than attacking somebody with a cleaver or an axe. That this is somebody who didn't so much want to see blood as wanted to kill this grocer for some reason. And later in 1918, when they're after the Maggio killings, when they're speculating about where their previous attacks, the name Sciambra comes up because what people remember is this is a young Italian grocer who's murdered. But they kind of forget that he's murdered in a very different way. And so this is why I just don't think he has a much to do with the Axeman attacks.
But after the Maggio attack, there is a graffito that's written that could possibly connect to, is that the one that connects to the Sciambras? Or is that connecting to a different cleaver crime?
There's one that refers, now, and we don't really, there was something written in chalk on the sidewalk. The thing is, we don't actually know the precise wording because each newspaper gives a different version. But it referred to Mrs. Tony. And the Sciambra, it was Tony Sciambra and his wife who were murdered. And so people thought this might have referred in some way to Mrs. Tony, Mrs. Sciambra. But I could never really make sense of this story and how it connected to the Axeman, except I kind of wonder if it's like just a bystander who gets convinced that this must, who remembers this most recent attack in 1912 and is convinced it has something to do with this attack on the Maggio 6 years later.
Now, as you said, we might not have the exact text, but I believe it was something to the effect of Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony, but Tony is spelled wrong. And correct me if I misquoted that.
I can check the exact quote because I gave all of the quotations.
And of course, the question I'm leading you to is, how likely is it that that message was written by the killer?
Yeah, it just... It seems unlikely to me, but I want to find the... Okay, yeah, here's the Times-Picayune says, Mrs. Joseph Maggio is going to sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony. The States says Mrs. Joseph Maggio is going to sit up tonight just right, Mrs. Tony. And the item says Mrs. Joseph Maggio will sit up tonight just right, Mrs. Tony.
Well, those have very different meanings. Just like Mrs. Tony, just right, Mrs. Tony. I mean, that's one sounds a lot more somber, if you ask me. But at this point, though, I would like to kind of move forward a little bit after the Maggios.
Okay.
Because one of the most famous Axeman attacks is on Louis Bessemer and Harriet Lowe. But after reading your book, I think you made a very convincing case on how maybe the Axeman wasn't even involved with that. But people can do this for themselves. Go on YouTube, pull up a video about the New Orleans Axeman. Very early on, they'll start talking about the attack on Louis Bessemer. Sometimes they'll even call him Louis Bezume. But as I understand, his heritage was Polish, not French. So, Louis Bessemer, we can call him. And would you like to share something about that story with us?
Okay. Louis Bessemer and the woman people thought mistakenly was his wife were attacked about a month after the Maggios. Louis Bessemer, when they're discovered, he actually is very reluctant to call an ambulance and to call the police, but the person who discovers them insists on it. The woman, who turns out to be a woman named Harriet Lowe, is very badly injured. And when the police interview her, she keeps, over several months, she keeps changing her story. And when the police, look at the crime scene, there are some things that are very, very different from the standard Axeman cases. First of all, the house was not broken into. She was attacked from the blood where the blood was, she was attacked out on kind of a back porch and then somehow stumbled and collapsed into her bedroom and collapsed onto her bed. Louis Bessemer, what he said, he said he woke up in bed, with an injury to his head, except that the blood evidence simply didn't support that. The police thought there'd be more blood there. Also, the attack did not seem to happen at the usual time. The Axeman consistently attacked between 1 and 3 in the morning. But the blood was so fresh when the police got there and the ambulance that they think he must have attacked, we're talking 5 or 6 in the morning when it was getting light and people could see who was coming and going from the grocery. And nobody saw anybody coming and going. And Mrs. Lowe changed her story several times. At first, she said it was a man of mixed race that she was waiting on in the grocery that attacked her. Well, the police knew that wasn't true because she was in her nightgown. She would not have been waiting on a customer. And at first, she insists Bessemer didn't do it. And then she says he did. She goes back to live with him. She nearly has a nervous breakdown. She ends up in the hospital again. She gets an infection and she's on her deathbed and she swears out that he was the one who attacked her. He goes on trial. And he is acquitted. And I think legally there are good grounds for his acquittal because her story changed so often. And there is somebody going around attacking grocers. But I suspect that, in fact, he was guilty. That is, he got, the Axeman usually concentrates his attack on the grocer in his bed. And clearly, Louis Bessemer wasn't attacked in his bed. And he did have a cut above his eye, but he wasn't harmed nearly as severely as Mrs. Lowe was. My suspicion is it was sort of an incident of domestic violence that got really out of hand. Bessemer was a very shady character. He had apparently changed his name several times. After he's acquitted, I can't trace him anywhere. I suspect he changed his name again. So that to me makes more sense, given the physical evidence and given the patterns that I found, than that they were actually other victims of the Axeman. I mean, I think Louis Bessemer was just very, very lucky that there was this person going around attacking grocers at the time.
Well, so many questions are forming right now, but Louis Bessemer is the one that gets accused of being a spy, right?
Yeah. At one point when Mrs. Lowe was in the hospital, she says, and she's saying that they're married, and he's saying, no, I'm divorced. My first wife lives, I think, in Cincinnati. We just had this platonic relationship. She says, my husband is German. And of course, at that time, the United States is at war with Germany, and there's this very strong anti-German sentiment. Well, Louis Bessemer says he's Polish. Well, he could be both. He could have been, ethnically Polish, but born in the German Empire, and he probably knew German. But the sort of predecessors of the FBI do get apparently called in, and nothing ever happens. I mean, they discover some papers written in a foreign language in his, hitting his trunk, but this wouldn't be terribly suspicious because he's from Europe. He's Polish. He probably speaks several different languages. But people really, given the times, given the war, people really react to this whole rumor that he's a spy. But he wouldn't have been a very good spy. People thought he was very odd. He drew a lot of attention to himself. So.
But if I recall the story about the papers that are found in the trunk, they are written in different languages, and some of them are German, Polish, and Russian. Is that true?
Well, it depends on which paper you read. The different newspapers report different languages. So I'm not sure. We don't know exactly what languages.
I just found
More,
that so odd because Germany and Russia were not allies during the First World War. They were on different sides of the
right,
war, and they're
right.
trying to say that he's a spy. Well, would he be like a double agent or something? And I, like I think it's more of what you said. Like to be very honest, it's just he's a European American, and perhaps he could read Russian and Polish and German, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe he understood the text and no one else did, but that's not so shocking.
And
But is
he,
this true? Oh, go ahead.
well, I was going to say it, he knew, I mean, he may have had relatives to whom he was writing in Yiddish, in German, in Russian. I mean, he may have been fluent in all these languages.
But is this true that Robert Talon named his section in his book The Axeman Wore Wings because of Louis Bessemer and Harriet Lowe, about how you said the Axeman allegedly committed that crime, yet there was no evidence that he ever entered the building? Is it because of that story, or was it a different one?
I think it might have been the Romano story
Oh,
where
Joe, no.
where the niece of Joseph Romano says that the Axeman disappeared as if he were on wings.
Oh,
I
okay,
think
okay.
that might be it.
Oh, yes. See, there's so many
From my
different
memory.
stories in this one, like compared to
Yeah.
some of the other true crime cases.
Mm.
Joe Romano was a barber, right? He was not a grocer. And is that correct?
But that's true. But his, I think it was his mother or his sister, maybe it was his mother and his sister, were running a grocery out of their front parlor. And
Oh, really?
he's the only male living in that house.
Oh, okay, okay.
So you have this same pattern of a grocery, an Italian male, Axeman comes in with their own axe that he's gotten out of the shed, attacks the male, kills him, and vanishes. So it fits very much into the pattern.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the different crimes that the Axeman has done. He's a home invader. He's committing his crimes first by cleaver and then by axe.
Mm-hmm.
And as of now, the Axeman may have written one message. Mrs. Joseph Mazio will sit up right like Mrs. Tony. Maybe, maybe. But
Maybe.
then the Axeman's most famous accomplishment is something he may not even have done, and
Mm-hmm.
that is the letter where the Axeman proclaims that he is a jazz fan. And before I learned anything else about this, you get on the internet and you learn about the New Orleans Axeman. The first thing you will find is this letter where the
Mm-hmm.
Axeman of New Orleans is proclaiming that he is a jazz fan. And
Mm-hmm.
would you like to introduce that? And we have, of course, some questions that will follow, but would you like to talk about that?
Okay, this letter appears in the Times-Picayune about a month after the Cortimiglia attacks. And this is an attack on, again, a couple Italian grocers in Gretna, which is just across the river from New Orleans. It's now part of Greater New Orleans. And their daughter is killed. They are badly injured. And they've, neighbors who are also Italian grocers are eventually arrested for the crime. But so this is what's going on at the time. And then you get this letter, which is published in the Times-Picayune by this person who signs it the Axeman. I don't think that the actual killer wrote this. It was written by somebody who was well educated. He refers to Tartarus, which is a classical allusion. I mean, if you just read it, it was written by somebody who clearly had a good education. From the eyewitness accounts, the Axeman is somebody who's working class, who would be unlikely to have that kind of education. Just the tone, to me, the tone of the letter reads like a sort of a fraternity joke. I mean, and it's clear from editorials that are written in newspapers afterwards that a lot of educated people just didn't take it seriously. Now, of course, they're not the ones being attacked by the Axeman. You have, Italian grocers, some of whom may not be literate, may not even have been able to read the letter, but they hear this rumor going around. So you do have people, Italian grocers, perhaps, first generation, from Sicily, are probably still a bit on the superstitious side, who are really frightened by this. But I don't think that most people, like newspaper editors, I don't think they really believed it was by the Axeman.
Well, no, I don't either, because it just sounds like it's coming from somebody who is so lighthearted that they don't have a single violent bone in their body. And now, what you will see, though, in a lot of pop culture sources is the Axeman is threatening in this letter that if you don't have a jazz band playing in your home or on your property, then he's going to attack you. I think the exact line is, "You'll get the axe," or something like that. And
yeah, he's saying, I'll be out, walking the earth, and,
I'm a big fan of jazz.
Yeah,
if you don't have this band playing, you'll get the axe.
Something like that, yeah. And the only suspect I have, and you can't libel the dead, so I can speculate about this. There was a local composer named, I think, Joseph John Davila, who wrote and made a bundle of money off a song called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz. And he really promoted it. And as I said, he made a lot of money on it. So it's possible. When I was discussing this with the retired homicide detective and was telling him this story, he said, first of all, no, the actual killer didn't write that letter. But I was telling him about the composer, and he went, he did it. So, I mean, I think suspicion might fall on him. He had a reason to do it. I don't think whoever wrote it intended for people to take it seriously. I think Davila was approaching it, like the writer of the letter, in a very lighthearted way. He could have been using the letter as a way to gin up interest in this song he'd written. So if I had to name a suspect, it would be the composer. But I don't know. But I don't think it was the actual killer.
Well, of course not. It's still unsolved. But did people actually follow through with that? I mean, as I said, the pop culture understanding is, yes, they did, that there actually were jazz bands playing all around the city that night. Did they actually go through with it?
Some people did. I mean, some people use it as an excuse. But no, it wasn't the kind of hysterical thing that gets described in some accounts. Yeah. Because, as I said, educated people do not seem to have really believed it. But you have people who are going to just use it as an excuse. Some people took it very lighthearted, but, let's have some jazz and keep the Axeman away. And as I said, there were some not well-educated Italians, who are, after all, the group who are being targeted, who did take it seriously and probably did stay up that night trying to keep the Axeman away. So.
Okay, though, but we've talked about the crimes. We've talked about some of the possible communications. Now, I would like to ask you a question that's a little bit more theoretical and cross-true crime, and that is, how do you think the Axeman is similar and different to some other high-profile true crime cases, such as Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac Killer? What do you think?
Well, as I said, I think the cases that tend to get a lot of attention and people tend to remember are the sexual sadists, like Jack the Ripper, like Ted Bundy. And I think the Axeman is attacking for different reasons. I mean, he has a resentment to work out. I I don't get that it's sort of sexual in nature. But he clearly, for whatever reason, it's important for him to use something with a very sharp edge and to get a lot of blood, to see a lot of blood. And, he's probably got some fantasy that he is working out, probably revenge fantasy. But one interesting question is, why did the whole sort of legend of the Axeman die out in New Orleans, except for Tallant's book, when, Jack the Ripper and some of these other stories have survived? And I do think it's the sexual element. I think people just get fascinated by that in particular. And I think it was lacking in the Axeman story. And I have read some true crime writers who say that the X-Men was after, the women, the female. But, when you look at the actual details of the case, I just don't see evidence for that.
Well, with a crime spree or like Jack the Ripper, I mean, very similarly, there are multiple homicides within a short amount of time, although the Ripper's time frame was much shorter. And the Ripper also possibly wrote a graffito on the wall, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The Ripper has at least 3 letters that are strongly considered to have come from the Ripper. The Axeman has 1. And, we can debate the authenticity perhaps at another time. That sounds to me so much like Jack the Ripper. And then we have the Zodiac Killer in the 1960s, who is like going to do those same things, except the Zodiac is going to create cryptograms, the ciphers, and like the codes. And maybe that's not a sexual thing, but that's something that people are still trying to figure out to this day. What is in the Zodiac ciphers? Only 2 of them have been truly solved, and there are other ways to rearrange things. Even one's been solved, except for the final line, the Z18. And but it seems like you do admit, though, that the Axeman is less popular than these other cases. And do you think it's also possibly because the Axeman just didn't leave a lot of clues? Like, he's not dropping a calling card after everything, and the witness descriptions are all very vague, and Caucasian male, working class clothes. Well, who's that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just not... There's less to get your teeth into, I think. I mean, there are a lot of cases when you go back in your research. I mean, there are cases that happen, local cases that are well known locally, and they just die out. Now, I mean, everybody had heard of Jack the Ripper. I mean, in New Orleans papers, he's referred to as, at one point, as, do we have our own local Jack the Ripper? But I think it's because of the kind of murders, particularly gruesome murders, that Jack the Ripper committed. And just the Axeman, I mean, while, they were pretty awful, you didn't have the sort of dissecting of people like Jack the Ripper did. So, and dissecting of women.
Yes, and although, because you've talked about profiling and you contacted a profiler, people have all types of profiles that they've created for Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer. John Douglas, whom we spoke about previously, he's done that. Now, if you could arrange that for the New Orleans Axeman, what do you think you would say? How old was he? I mean, what type of personality did he have? Was he power assertive? Was he a sadist? I mean, like, what would your profile of the Axeman be?
Well, I think he's white, working class. I think when he starts, he's probably, from the description, maybe in his 30s at the latest. He's not that, he's neither that young or that old. He is a criminal. I mean, he's got experience breaking and entering. And he's just got some deep-seated resentment of this particular class of people. And so I think it's sort of economic or social. I mean, and because you have to remember at the time, the South was was literally segregated into black and white. And these Sicilians were kind of liminal. They were kind of in the middle, and people didn't know quite how to classify them. But some were doing very well. And there was some resentments of this. And when you have the Italians taking over this particular economic niche of the corner groceries, they were displacing somebody, right? They were outperforming somebody. And there must have been some resentment of these people who not everybody considered quite white. And so I think that's, it's a profile of some working class white male who feels hard done by, resentful, inferior, you know.
Certainly, and that's most likely very accurate. And a final question for you would be, what other true crime cases do you follow outside of this?
Well, when I was working on this book, I did a lot of reading in true crime. And I read about particularly the BTK killer in Wichita. And the one that got me interested, in fact, in serial killers was Ann Rule's The Stranger Beside Me about Ted Bundy. But when I finished The Axeman, at first I thought, well, maybe I'll do something else with serial killers. There's some interesting cases in England about killers that had been done. But then I realized I couldn't keep going. I mean, that I even thought about doing maybe a podcast, but then I thought, I just can't do this. I need a break from serial killers. So I turned to other things because I found it kind of gruesome. And I admire people who can go into it and stick to it and are really expert in all of these cases. But I just, I needed a break from it after, about 9 years of being up to my eyeballs in serial killers.
I see. And out of curiosity, which cases were they in England that you were following?
Oh, I'm trying to remember. There was that case of the fellow who was killing people and dissolving their bodies. Do you remember his name?
I don't know about dissolving. You mean not dissecting, but dissolving?
Actually dissolving. And then there were just the individual cases, like the doctor who was murdering patients.
Harold Shipman.
Yeah.
Dr. Death, yeah.
Yeah, and the solicitor. There was a movie made of it. The solicitor near the Welsh border who was accused of murdering his wife and was eventually hanged.
Oh, was that an older story?
No, I think it was early 20th century.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah. It just got a lot of attention because the murder rate in England in like the early 20th century was fairly low. So when you did have a murder like that, it got a lot of attention all over the country.
And you said the guy was a lawyer, not a doctor, right? You don't mean Dr. Crippen or anything, do you?
Well, Crippen is one of the cases I was interested in. No, this guy was a solicitor. Yeah, he was a lawyer. He was a lawyer. And he was maybe doing some shady things and maybe needed to kill his wife to get, so she wouldn't divorce him. And I can't remember I can't remember his name, but I just decided, nah, I couldn't do it. I needed a break.
Well, immediately after this interview, I'm going to get on Google and find person dissolving bodies in the United Kingdom. I kid thee not, because you've definitely captured my curiosity. But we have to, I think that there's a certain balance that we have to recognize about these are terrible stories, but at the same time, we want to know more, and that's purely what it is. And it sounds a little bit familiar. Like I'm familiar with Stephen Marshall, the Jigsaw killer, who would cut up the bodies of the victims, and he did it with, like, as well as a surgeon could, even though he was like a bartender or something. But I don't think that's the story you're talking about.
No, no, no. This was a fellow who dissolved bodies in the bathtub. He would dissolve them, I think, in something that he put in the bathtub. Yeah.
Ah, yes. Well, they tried that on Breaking Bad, and it ended up horribly. I have to find out how this person did it. So,
Well,
as I said,
if it occurs to me, if I can find the name, I will send it to you, because I did think about it, but I thought, nah, I can't do that. And I think a fair amount's been written about him. But what I find is that, shouldn't necessarily put you off, because I find that when you go back to the original sources, a lot of what gets written is actually not accurate. A lot of what had been written about the mafia turned out not to be accurate when you go back to the original sources. So,
On that note, though, I guess there is another question we have to bring about, and that is, do you think people should read Robert Tallant's book, Ready to Hang, and the Axeman Wore Wings? I mean, that's the section in the book on the Axeman. Do you think that's worth reading for the general public?
Yeah, I do. I do. He was a good storyteller. A lot that he was telling was based on oral tradition. In oral tradition, there's always, the possibility that something wrong is going to creep in. And I always have much more faith in anything that's written down at the time. But yeah, I mean, if it were not for Talent, that story wouldn't have been preserved.
Yes, and if anybody's curious about the book Ready to Hang, I have 2 episodes about some of Robert Tallant's other stories in that book. One is on the Basin Street murder, and one is on the story of Etienne Deschamps, and it's about the murder of Juliette Deitch, sometimes pronounced Deitch. I invite people to check that out. You can also hit the like button and subscribe again. And Miriam C. Davis, do you have any final send-off for the listeners of Black Box Online Radio, and tell them where they can find your book and any concluding notes?
Well, you can find the book on Amazon, and the only thing I haven't mentioned is Talents had mentioned Joseph Mumfrey as the main suspect, but the one thing that I did prove, I think, conclusively, is that Mumfrey couldn't have done it, because when you get hold of his records, his prison records, he was in Angola during the murders, during just about each of the murders. And but he was gunned down by Mike Pepitone's widow in Los Angeles, and she emptied 2 revolvers into him, including like 3 shots in the back, and she was acquitted by a jury. So this was a time when, he had it coming, worked better as a defense than it does now. But the story, when it got transmitted to New Orleans, got garbled again by the media. And that's how Joseph Mumfrey, as the Axeman, sort of entered popular legend. It wasn't Talent's fault. It was the media at the time.
Right, and you and I had the opportunity to correspond once, and you had told me some things about Joseph Mumfrey. But if I had known that, when you read Robert Tallant's The Axeman Wings, it sounds like he's guilty. I mean, I know it's like he has a suspect, and he's making a case for the suspect, and it's not like I had 5 other Axeman suspects that I could turn to by name, but it sounded like, okay, it's another example of, we know who the killer was, it's just there wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest. We see this with serial killer cases all the time. Think about the ones we've talked about already, the Zodiac and Jack the Ripper. But overall, though, as you just said, he wasn't the Axeman, of course, and that just adds to the mystery.
Yep. I think the chances of solving this case now, they're not non-existent, but they're very low. I have this fantasy that I'll stumble upon a newspaper report about somebody in Texas who was caught leaving an Italian grocer's place at 3 a.m. holding a bloody axe, because that'll be the Axeman. Maybe in 1923 3 or something, and they hanged him. That, you know, because that would be the Axeman, because that just wasn't a common thing to do. So.
Well, I guess we'll just keep investigating and see what we find. But until then, the book is called The Axeman of New Orleans, and the subtitle is The True Story.
The
Is
True
that right?
Story. The True
The
Story.
Axeman of New Orleans, The True Story by Miriam C. Davis. Thank you so much.
Thank you.